All right, so let's dive into one of the most intriguing geopolitical theories out there, Michael Pillsbury's idea of the 100-year marathon. It's this notion that China has this quiet, carefully measured plan to replace the United States as the global superpower by, get this, 2049. That year isn't random, right?
No, not at all. 2049 marks the centenary of the Communist Revolution in China. It serves as a symbolic anchor for what China views as its ultimate national revival, a moment when centuries of perceived humiliation and, more recently, subordination to Western dominance will be replaced by a restored Chinese-led world order.
Perceived humiliation, we're talking about the century of humiliation, right? I mean, the Opium Wars, occupation by Japan, there's a lot to unpack there. How does that figure into their strategy, though?
It's integral. The century of humiliation narrative is deeply ingrained in China's national psyche. It portrays a period from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century when foreign powers, primarily Western nations and Japan, exploited and divided China. This history fuels a collective determination to ensure that China regains its rightful place in the global hierarchy and avoids being vulnerable again.
And unlike, say, the US, which tends to lean on its founding ideals, China's strategy seems so historically calculated, almost mathematical. Pillsbury ties that back to ancient doctrines, doesn't he?
Exactly. He highlights frameworks like the 36 stratagems and lessons from the Warring States period. These emphasize patience, deception, and exploiting the adversary's strengths and weaknesses to achieve victory. They transcend conventional Western military strategies that often favor direct confrontation. In Chinese philosophy, victory without combat is the highest form of mastery.
Wait, so when we're talking about things like economic partnerships or even their Confucius institutes abroad, do you think we're seeing those doctrines in action even today?
Yes, and perhaps most vividly. For instance, one stratagem, hide your strength, bide your time, is profoundly relevant. It suggests maintaining a low profile while building power incrementally. Modern manifestations could include initiatives like the Belt and Road Project, which outwardly appear cooperative, but aim to deepen reliance on China while increasing its global reach and influence. It's strategic camouflage, in effect.
That's unsettling. It's like this idea of cultivating dependency while framing it as mutual growth. And we've kind of played into it in some ways, haven't we?
We have. Whether it's through technology transfers, educational collaborations, or even international institutions, there's been a pattern where we've underestimated the level of strategic foresight involved. China's leadership isn't working on election cycles, their timeline spans generations, and this is precisely Pillsbury's main point. They're executing a grand design.
Wow, so we're looking at a strategy literally centuries in the making. And it seems, just so layered from invoking historical grievances to adopting these ancient strategic guidelines. It's not so much a sprint as it is this.
A marathon. Precisely. Their approach mirrors the logic of the Warring States period, where neighboring powers competed over centuries for dominance. Even then, the emphasis was on alliances, deception, and exploiting rivalries, as contrasted with decisive, direct blows.
So fascinating. It feels like the more we discuss this, the more I realize how much of the playbook is hidden in plain sight. That combination of historical grievance and meticulous long term planning, it's not just about overt intimidation, but also almost rewriting the rules of engagement. William, the more we unpack China's long term strategy and its historical grounding, the more striking it becomes. It's not just the execution of a marathon, it's how often the U.S. has either underestimated or outright misread these ambitions. It almost feels like we've been repeatedly blindsided, doesn't it?
Indeed, it's a pattern stretching back decades. Much of it stems from what you might call wishful thinking, projecting Western ideals onto another culture. The idea that engagement and trade automatically lead to alignment in values and governance has proven, well, dangerously naive. And that optimism, often rooted in the assumption that China was evolving toward democracy, never accounted for their actual political trajectory. Pillsbury calls this out, right? He does, and quite starkly. While many in the West believed economic liberalization would walk hand in hand with political reform, the opposite has held true. Under leaders like Xi Jinping, China has doubled down on state control, authoritarian capitalism, if you will. It's a model where the economy thrives, but dissent is systematically squashed.
And then you look at Xi himself, right? He's steering this shift with what seems like a really calculated approach. I mean, his leadership didn't just happen in a vacuum, though.
That's absolutely correct. Xi Jinping's ascent marks the consolidation of a hawkish faction within the Communist Party, individuals who see the world not as interconnected and cooperative, but as competitive and zero-sum. And their guiding principle? Leverage China's historical grievances and economic strength to assert dominance on the global stage.
But these hawks, this faction, they're not new, right? Pillsbury describes them as always being there in the background, influencing policy even when they weren't front and center.
Precisely. These are the Ying Pai, or hawks, as China calls them. For decades, they've been publishing texts, speaking on strategy, and arguing for a stronger, more assertive China. Their vision rejects the Western-led world order outright, calling instead for a rebalanced system where China takes its place as the center of power.
Wait, center of power? That's putting it mildly. It's more like they're working toward replacing the United States altogether, isn't it?
Exactly. The ultimate goal goes beyond coexistence and into supremacy. That's what Xi Jinping's policies reflect. Assertiveness in the South China Sea, the Belt and Road Initiative, even trade policies. These all reinforce the broader aim of creating a China-centric world order by 2049.
Wow. And the level of cohesion, of unity within their strategy, it's so different from the way the US operates, especially with election cycles that shift priorities every few years.
And that, Eleanor, might be one of our greatest missteps, assuming China thinks in the same short-term frameworks that dominate democratic nations. Their hawkish leaders take the long view, and they've harnessed a strategy that's built for the marathon, not the sprint.
It's all so tied together, the strongman leadership, the hawkish mindset, the rejection of democracy, and yet we've contributed to their rise. It's like we handed them the tools, thinking we were building something else entirely. You know, William, when you frame it like that, the marathon mindset versus short term cycles, it really highlights just how fundamentally different their approach is from ours. It's unnerving to think how often we've ceded ground without even realizing it.
I agree, Eleanor. In fact, exploring long-term geopolitical strategies like this, it not only deepens our understanding, but also challenges us to think more critically about global power dynamics. And frankly, that's what we all need to do in times like these.
Exactly. And, you know, to our listeners, if you're finding these deep dives thought provoking or even just, fun,
Well, relatively speaking, of course.
of course, fun for nerds like us, maybe. But seriously, if you're enjoying what we're doing here, consider subscribing. It's one of the best ways to keep this community going and ensure we can keep having these insightful conversations. And subscribing isn't just about listening to us talk, though we're flattered if you find that worthwhile. It's about supporting a broader discussion, exploring topics that matter, and connecting with a larger audience who's curious about the world, and it helps keep the coffee coming. Really, though, every subscription helps to grow this platform and bring these ideas to more people. So if this discussion about China's strategy or any of our other conversations has resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Absolutely. We appreciate you being here, adding your curiosity to this space, and hopefully taking something valuable with you each time. Well, William, after encouraging our listeners to think critically and take part in these discussions, it only feels right to dive further into this 100-year marathon. The question that keeps circling back for me is, how do we actually respond to something so meticulously calculated and sprawling? Where do we even begin?
It's no small question, Eleanor. And honestly, what Pillsbury calls for is a complete recalibration, rethinking our assumptions, our strategies, even perhaps the way we define strength and global leadership. I think his emphasis on recognizing asymmetric strategies like the assassin's mace is a vital starting point.
Right, because the assassin's mace basically shows us that China's not following the same rules we're used to, right? They're exploiting vulnerabilities and doing it with tactics designed for maximum impact, but without the need for direct confrontation.
Exactly. It's about finding leverage points where their relative weaknesses can be offset by strategic advantages. From cyber capabilities to anti-satellite weapons, they've designed this approach to disrupt and disable technologically advanced adversaries like the United States. It's not about matching strength for strength. It's about throwing us off balance in ways we might not anticipate.
And if we're not anticipating it, I mean, that's the whole problem Pillsbury highlights. We've underestimated their strategy for, well, decades, whether it's through technology transfers or ignoring cyber espionage, or even, those early assumptions that trade would lead to democracy. It's like we've been writing checks with no idea of the long term cost.
Precisely. Pillsbury points to missteps that have consistently enhanced China's position. The very things the US thought were fostering partnership were, in reality, laying the groundwork for strategic competition. And now, we're dealing with a China that's stronger, more assertive, and frankly, operating with a mindset that prioritizes dominance over coexistence.
So then, do you think the US is equipped to even respond appropriately at this point? Pillsbury talks about this reevaluation, but are we capable of that kind of overhaul when we're, dealing with election cycles and short-term priorities?
It's a difficult challenge, but not insurmountable. What's needed, as Pillsbury suggests, is a bipartisan long-term strategy that recognizes the extent of the competition. Less reaction, more anticipation. It requires viewing China not just as a partner or a competitor, but as a rival with a fundamentally different worldview and agenda. And Eleanor, recognizing that is half the battle.
I love how you say half the battle. It's such a deliberate choice of words: battles, strategies, deception. This whole discussion feels like it's taken straight out of some ancient war manual. And in a way, it is, right?
Very much so. As we discussed earlier, China's doctrines are rooted in thousands of years of strategy. But the difference today is that these concepts are being reinterpreted through the lens of modern geopolitical realities, technology, economics, global influence. It's ancient philosophy meeting 21st century power dynamics.
Such a fascinating mix, isn't it? And, I think Pillsbury's biggest takeaway for us might be that this isn't about fear mongering. It's about paying attention, being intentional about recognizing what's happening. This competition isn't going away, William.
No, it isn't. But if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that awareness and adaptability can be powerful tools. And perhaps, Eleanor, by having conversations like this, by connecting the dots and shedding light on these strategies, we're taking a small yet meaningful step toward addressing the challenge.
Well said, William. And to our listeners, thank you for sticking with us through these big ideas and tough questions. Understanding China's strategy might not provide instant answers, but it does give us a framework, a way to start thinking critically about where the world is headed and how we can respond.
Indeed, this is not just a discussion for policymakers. It's for anyone who cares about the future of global stability and how leadership and strategy shape the world we live in. So thank you for engaging with this topic and taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for tuning in to the Power Book of Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our growing community. Click the bell icon so you never miss an update. We have so much more inspiring content coming your way.